My sister called me screaming at 2 in the morning. Your husband had a terrible accident. He is in surgery. Come to Saint Jude Hospital right now. I froze and whispered into the receiver. That cannot be. He is sleeping right beside me. But when I arrived at the emergency room, my heart stopped when I saw what my family was desperately trying to hide. My name is Lauren, 33 years old, and I work as a senior forensic accountant for a top-tier financial investigation firm. Of course, if you asked my parents, Cynthia and Thomas, they would tell you I am just a low-level data entry clerk who barely makes ends meet. They have always preferred the glamorous lies of my younger sister Morgan and her husband Donovan. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to deal with toxic relatives who completely underestimated your intelligence. You will definitely want to hear how I turned their malicious crime into the ultimate trap. The shrill ring of my cell phone shattered the quiet peace of our bedroom at 2:15 in the morning. I fumbled in the dark, squinting at the bright screen. It was Morgan. We rarely spoke unless she needed money or wanted to brag about her latest luxury vacation, so a call at this hour sent an immediate spike of adrenaline through my veins. I answered, and her frantic, breathless voice flooded the speaker. Lauren, you need to get to Saint Jude Hospital right now. David was in a horrific car crash. The doctors just rushed him into emergency surgery. It is bad, Lauren, really bad. Come fast. My blood ran completely cold. The room seemed to spin as panic gripped my chest. I opened my mouth to ask what happened, but the words died in my throat. I turned my head toward the other side of the bed. There was David, my husband of 6 years, a calm and grounded landscape architect who rarely stayed out past 10. He was lying face down on his pillow, snoring softly, completely unharmed, and very much asleep in our home. I stared at his rising and falling chest, my brain struggling to process the absolute absurdity of my sister's hysterical performance. I pulled the phone away from my ear for a second, making sure I had actually answered a real call and was not trapped in some bizarre nightmare. Morgan was still putting on an award-winning show on the other end, producing fake sobs and demanding to know how fast I could get there. I did not hang up. I did not tell her David was safely in bed next to me. Instead, a cold, sharp realization washed over me. Morgan was not playing a prank. She was executing a calculated scheme. My mind instantly flashed back to a situation 5 years ago. Morgan had stolen my mail, intercepted a credit card offer, and forged my signature to open an account in my name. She maxed it out in 3 days. To buy a limited edition designer handbag she paraded around at country club brunches. When the collection agency called me, I was furious and threatened to call the police. But my mother, Cynthia, stepped in immediately. She cried, manipulated, and ultimately forced me to absorb the debt, claiming I was being a selfish, jealous sibling who wanted to ruin my sister's bright future over a silly little mistake. That silly little mistake took me 2 years to pay off, and it taught me a valuable lesson. My sister was capable of committing serious fraud without a single ounce of remorse, and my parents would always shield her from the consequences. So sitting in the dark bedroom with my husband safely asleep beside me, I knew exactly what I had to do. Morgan was up to something massive, something illegal, and if I called her out over the phone, she would just hang up and find a way to cover her tracks. I needed to catch her red-handed. "Okay," I said, forcing my voice to tremble, faking the panic she expected to hear. "I am leaving right now. I will be there in 20 minutes." I ended the call and quietly slipped out of bed. I gently shook David's shoulder. He stirred, blinking sleepily in the dim light. I told him Morgan just called with a crazy story and I needed to go down to the hospital to see what kind of scam she was pulling. David immediately wanted to come with me, his protective instincts kicking in, but I told him to stay put, keep the doors locked, and not answer his phone. If Morgan or my parents knew he was fine, they would change their story before I could gather the evidence I needed. I threw on some sweatpants and a thick coat, grabbed my car keys, and drove through the deserted city streets. My mind worked frantically, piecing together the puzzle. Morgan was married to Donovan, a smooth-talking African-American man who claimed to be a luxury real estate entrepreneur. Donovan always wore tailored Italian suits, drove a flashy sports car, and talked loudly about his multi-million-dollar investment funds. Yet, as a forensic accountant, I had always noticed the glaring inconsistencies in his lifestyle. The expensive dinners were always paid for with different corporate credit cards, and he constantly pressured our parents' wealthy friends for bridge loans. If Donovan and Morgan were involved in a hospital emergency at 2 in the morning, and they were desperately trying to use David's name, it meant only one thing. Someone needed medical care, and they needed my husband's spotless medical insurance to pay for it. I pulled into the parking lot of Saint Jude Hospital, my grip tight on the steering wheel. The automatic doors of the emergency room slid open, the harsh fluorescent lights blinding me for a second. I braced myself for the performance of a lifetime. I expected to find my sister in tears, pacing the waiting room, acting like a distraught family member. Instead, I spotted Morgan standing near the billing counter. She was fully dressed in designer clothes, her makeup perfect, not a single tear in sight. Her face was completely cold and calculating. She saw me walk through the doors. She did not run to hug me. She did not offer a word of comfort about my supposedly dying husband. Instead, she grabbed a thick stack of medical intake forms from the counter, marched straight toward me, and shoved a blue ink pen directly into my chest. "Sign the guarantor form for the patient's wife," Morgan ordered. Her voice lacked any trace of the hysteria she had used on the phone. "Your corporate platinum health insurance covers 100% of major surgeries, right? Sign it fast so the doctor can operate." I looked down at the clipboard she had jammed against my chest. The bold black letters at the top of the hospital intake form seemed to scream at me. Patient name, David Collins. Right below that, neatly printed in blue ink, was my husband's actual social security number. My blood boiled. This was not just a desperate lie to get me out of bed. This was a calculated federal crime. In my line of work as a forensic accountant, I stare at forged documents for a living. I track money laundering, wire fraud, and identity theft. I know exactly what it looks like when a criminal tries to bypass the financial system. The penalty for medical identity theft includes massive fines and years behind bars. I have helped send corrupt executives to federal prison for exactly this kind of paperwork. And here was my own sister standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room, brazenly handing me a felony on a plastic clipboard. If I signed that paper as David's wife, confirming his identity for a surgery he was not having, I would be committing insurance fraud. I would be a willing accomplice to a federal offense. I snatched the clipboard from her manicured hands, my eyes narrowing. "You used David's social security number," I asked, my voice dangerously low. "How did you even get this?" Morgan rolled her eyes, shifting her weight impatiently in her expensive designer heels. "Does it matter? Mom keeps copies of old tax returns in her home office. I just grabbed the file. Stop making a big deal out of nothing, Lauren. The hospital needs spousal consent to authorize the billing and push him into the operating room. Your company gives you that elite tier coverage. It will not cost you a single penny out of pocket. Just scribble your name so we can get this over with." "A big deal out of nothing," I repeated. The absolute audacity was breathtaking. She was asking me to defraud an insurance company out of hundreds of thousands of dollars, risking my career and my freedom, all to save her own skin. I shoved the clipboard back at her chest. "Where is he?" Morgan stumbled back a step, clearly not expecting my resistance. "What are you doing?" "I told you he is prepping for surgery. You cannot go back there." I pushed past her, my sneakers squeaking against the polished linoleum floor. The double doors leading to the intensive care and surgical prep unit were just a few yards away. I marched straight toward them, ignoring Morgan's frantic protests as she scrambled to keep up with me. "Lauren, stop. You are going to ruin everything," she hissed, reaching out to grab my arm. I yanked my arm away with enough force to make her stumble again. "Watch me," I snapped. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and scanned the row of glass-walled recovery rooms. The nurse's station was busy, alarms beeping and machines humming, creating a chaotic symphony that perfectly matched the rage building inside me. I walked down the sterile white corridor, checking the digital monitors above each door. Finally, I saw it. Room 4. The digital display proudly read, Collins David. I stepped up to the large observation window and looked inside. A man was lying unconscious on the hospital bed, hooked up to a ventilator and several intravenous drips. His head was heavily wrapped in thick white bandages, obscuring his facial features completely. A rigid cervical collar braced his neck, and a heavy cast encased his left leg. The heart monitor beeped in a steady, agonizing rhythm. If you just glanced quickly, you might assume it was a terrible tragedy. But I did not glance quickly. I am trained to look at the details. My husband David is a landscape architect who spends his days working outside under the sun. He is a white man with a farmer's tan and calloused hands. The man lying in that bed, despite the bandages covering his face, had deep dark brown skin. His right arm resting outside the thin hospital blanket was completely exposed. Thick, intricate tattoos wrapped around his bicep and forearm. I recognized those tattoos instantly. They featured a flashy, stylized skyline of luxury real estate properties and a massive lion head on his shoulder. It was the exact sleeve of ink Donovan loved to show off when he wore his custom-tailored polo shirts to my parents' house. I stared at the heavy gold chain resting on the bedside table inside a plastic patient belongings bag. It was Donovan's signature chain. There was absolutely no mistaking it. The man lying in room 4, about to receive an incredibly expensive life-saving surgery under my husband's name, was Donovan, my African-American brother-in-law. The man who claimed to be a multi-million-dollar luxury real estate developer was currently committing criminal fraud because he could not afford to pay his own hospital bills. I stood frozen, staring at the sheer insanity of the situation. They had brought Donovan into the emergency room, slapped David's identity on him, and hoped the chaotic, overworked emergency staff would just process the paperwork without asking too many questions. They were banking on my absolute compliance to seal the deal and foot the bill. Morgan stepped up right next to me. She looked through the glass, then turned her face toward mine. The mask of the grieving family member was completely gone. Her features were twisted into a snarl of desperate entitlement. "You see him," she whispered harshly, checking over her shoulder to make sure no nurses were listening. "He crashed his car. It is a massive disaster. He needs this surgery immediately." I slowly turned my head to look at her. "That is Donovan's," I stated clearly, letting the reality of her crime hang in the heavy air between us. "You stole my husband's identity to admit Donovan. Keep your voice down." Morgan snapped her perfectly manicured nails, digging into my forearm. Donovan was driving a sports car he just leased. He had a few drinks. He crashed into a concrete barrier. He does not have premium health insurance, Lauren. His business is going through a transitional phase right now. If we admit him under his own name, he will be buried in $500,000 of medical debt. The hospital will garnish his business accounts. So your solution is to commit federal fraud?" I asked, shaking off her hand in disgust. "You want me to commit federal fraud to save your husband from his own drunk driving accident?" Morgan gritted her teeth. Her eyes flared with that familiar toxic rage she always used when she did not get her way. She leaned in close, her breath hot against my cheek. "He is in the middle of securing funding for a massive luxury condo project. If his investors find out he was driving drunk, crashed an uninsured car, and is drowning in medical debt, they will pull out. His reputation will be ruined. Mom and Dad would be devastated if Donovan lost his business. They have been bragging about him to the entire golf club. You owe it to the family to protect him." She shoved the pen back toward my hand. "Sign the paper, Lauren. Are you seriously going to stand there and watch your brother-in-law die over a technicality?" Before I could even formulate a proper response to Morgan's absolute insanity, the heavy double doors of the waiting area burst open. My parents, Cynthia and Thomas, rushed through the corridor like they were arriving at a high society gala that had gone horribly wrong. My father was still wearing his expensive golf club pullover, his face flushed red with exertion and pure panic. My mother trailed closely behind him, clutching her designer purse, her eyes darting around the emergency room until they landed on us. I honestly expected them to be horrified. A small, foolish part of my brain thought that surely my parents would draw the line at federal identity theft. I thought they would slap the clipboard out of Morgan's hands, demand to know what she was thinking, and fix this mess. Instead, Thomas marched straight up to me, his chest heaving, and pointed a thick, accusatory finger directly at my face. "Sign the paper right now, Lauren." My father barked, his voice echoing slightly in the sterile hospital hallway. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not ask if David was actually hurt. He went straight to the protection of his golden son-in-law. "Do you have any idea what is at stake here?" Thomas continued, lowering his voice to a harsh, aggressive whisper so the nursing staff would not hear. Donovan was driving an unregistered Porsche. He hit a concrete median at 80 miles an hour. He has been drinking. If the police run his actual name, or if this gets out to his investors, his entire career is completely over. He is raising capital for a $30 million real estate project next week. We cannot let a DUI and an uninsured car crash destroy the reputation he has built for this family. I stared at my father, utterly disgusted by the words coming out of his mouth. "You want me to commit a felony to cover up his drunk driving?" I asked, my voice dangerously steady. "He could have killed someone tonight. He is committing medical identity theft, and you are actually defending him." My father scoffed, waving his hand dismissively as if federal laws were merely minor inconveniences meant only for the lower classes. "It is just paperwork. Stop being so dramatic and do what is best for the family for once in your life." Before I could step back, my mother lunged forward. Cynthia grabbed my upper arm, her manicured acrylic nails digging painfully into my skin through the fabric of my winter coat. Her eyes were wild, filled with that familiar toxic mix of entitlement and rage she always reserved exclusively for me. "Your husband is just a guy who plants bushes for a living." Cynthia hissed, her face inches from mine, completely disregarding the fact that David held a master's degree in landscape architecture. If his medical record gets a little dirty, if his insurance premiums go up, absolutely no one is going to care. He does not have elite investors looking into his background. Donovan does. Donovan is going to be a multi-millionaire. I tried to yank my arm away, but her grip was like a vice. She leaned in closer, her breath smelling of expensive wine from whatever dinner party they had abandoned to come here. "Do not be selfish, Lauren." Cynthia spat, her voice dripping with venom. "Do not ruin this like you ruined things the last time. Are you going to be as spiteful as you were when you refused to give up your house down payment to pay for Morgan's wedding? We needed that money to secure the country club venue, and you selfishly kept it to buy that mediocre suburban house with your gardener husband. You owe your sister this. You owe us." The memory of that wedding incident hit me like a physical blow, but it also crystallized everything in my mind. 5 years ago, David and I had saved every single penny we earned to put a down payment on our first home. Morgan had blown through her own wedding budget in a matter of weeks and demanded my life savings to fund her lavish reception. When I flatly refused, my parents did not speak to me for 6 months, claiming I lacked family loyalty. They genuinely believed that the money I worked 80-hour weeks to earn belonged to Morgan by default. Now they believed my husband's identity, his pristine credit, and his clean legal record also belonged to Morgan and her fraudulent husband. They were perfectly willing to throw David and me under the bus, potentially sending us to federal prison, just to maintain the illusion of Donovan's fake luxury empire. They were not just toxic, they were entirely morally bankrupt. The hurt I used to feel when they chose Morgan over me evaporated instantly. It was replaced by the cold, calculating precision of a forensic financial investigator. I was no longer the scapegoat daughter seeking their approval. I was an auditor looking at an active crime scene. My training kicked in, pushing aside all the emotional baggage and leaving behind only hard logic and the absolute certainty that these people needed to be stopped. I looked at my mother, then at my father, and finally at my sister. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. Let go of my arm, Mom. I said, my tone so icy it made her immediately drop her hand and step back in shock. What are you doing? Thomas demanded, stepping forward to block my path to the nurse's station. I am doing what a responsible citizen does, I replied, unlocking my screen with a quick swipe. I am calling the police to report a drunk driver, an unregistered vehicle crash, and a textbook case of medical identity theft. I am sure the authorities will be very interested in Donovan's $30 million investor fund. I dialed 911 and my thumb hovered deliberately over the call button. I expected them to panic. I expected my parents to beg or Morgan to lunge forward and snatch the phone out of my hand. Instead, Morgan did not even flinch. A slow, chilling smirk spread across her perfectly contoured face. She reached into her designer purse and casually pulled out her own smartphone, holding it up so the glowing screen was directly in my line of sight. Morgan held her phone up the screen, brightly illuminating her malicious smile. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper that only I could hear. Go ahead and call them Lauren. Morgan taunted, her eyes gleaming with dark triumph. Tell the police everything. But before you do, you should know that I already used David's social security number to admit Donovan 2 hours ago. I used the hospital tablet to forge your electronic signature on the consent and financial liability forms. The paperwork is completely finalized and stamped in their system. My parents stood right behind her, their chests puffing out with pride, as if Morgan had just negotiated a brilliant corporate merger instead of committing a federal felony. Morgan took a step closer, invading my personal space. If you call the cops now and claim identity theft, it becomes your word against mine. But the digital footprint shows your husband was admitted, and your signature is on the dotted line. The police will look at the insurance payout, and they will immediately charge you and David as co-conspirators in a federal insurance fraud ring. You will lose your supposedly pristine career. David will lose his business. You have absolutely no way out, big sister. You are going to shut your mouth, go back to your little house, and let my husband get the surgery he needs. I stood completely still under the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room. A normal person would have screamed. A normal sister would have lunged forward, grabbed Morgan by her perfectly styled hair, and dragged her to the nearest security guard. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins, urging me to fight back, to tear their smug expressions right off their faces. But I am not just a normal person. I am a senior forensic financial investigator. My entire career is built on dismantling complex webs of deception, tracing offshore accounts, and sending arrogant white-collar criminals to federal prison. As I looked at my sister, my mother, and my father, I did not see family members anymore. I saw a criminal enterprise, and more importantly, I saw a massive, glaring vulnerability. If Donovan was truly on the verge of securing $30 million for a luxury real estate fund, he could easily afford to pay for this surgery out of pocket, even without insurance. He could have hired private physicians. He could have written a check. The fact that Morgan was willing to risk federal prison to steal my husband's medical benefits meant they were completely broke. It meant Donovan's entire empire was a fabricated illusion. Calling the local police tonight would lead to a messy, chaotic domestic dispute. Morgan would cry. My parents would hire expensive defense attorneys using whatever credit they had left. The local cops might even dismiss it as a civil family matter regarding insurance confusion. Donovan would likely get a slap on the wrist, a misdemeanor, and walk away to continue his scams. I did not want a slap on the wrist. I wanted them utterly destroyed. I wanted the FBI and the IRS tearing their lives apart piece by piece. To do that, I needed to dig up the roots of whatever massive financial crime Donovan was currently hiding. I needed access to his banking records, his corporate filings, and his investor lists. I needed them to feel safe and victorious so they would drop their guard. I looked at the three of them. They were practically vibrating with arrogant satisfaction, completely convinced they had trapped me in a corner. I slowly lowered my hand. I slid my smartphone back into my deep coat pocket. The silence in the hallway was thick and heavy, broken only by the distant hum of hospital machinery. I looked Morgan dead in the eyes. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I gave her one slow, deliberate nod. Without uttering a single word, I turned my back on my family. I walked away from the intensive care unit, my sneakers making soft sounds against the polished floor. I pushed through the emergency room exit doors and stepped out into the freezing night air. The cold wind hit my face, but I felt incredibly calm. The kind of calm that comes right before a devastating storm. I walked to my car, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. I gripped the steering wheel, taking a deep, steadying breath. They thought they had won. They truly believed they had outsmarted a woman who spends 40 hours a week auditing corporate embezzlement rings. They had just handed me the key to their destruction, and they were too ignorant to realize it. The drive back to my house was a blur of calculating thoughts and strategic planning. I mentally mapped out the databases I would need to access tomorrow. I categorized the federal statutes they had violated: medical identity theft, wire fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. It was a beautiful list, and I was going to ensure the prosecution had an airtight case. When I pulled into my driveway, the house was dark and quiet. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. David was awake, sitting on the edge of the couch in the living room with the reading lamp turned on. His face was etched with worry. He stood up the second I walked in. "What happened?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. "Is everyone alive? What kind of scam is Morgan running this time?" I took off my coat and hung it on the rack. I walked over to my husband, a man who worked hard, paid his taxes, and never asked for anything he did not earn. I looked into his honest eyes and knew I had to play this carefully. If I told David they stole his social security number tonight, his protective nature would take over. He would drive straight back to that hospital and throw a punch that could land him in jail. Donovan crashed his leased sports car, I said, keeping my voice level and soothing. He was driving drunk. Morgan wanted me to help them cover it up from the police. I refused and walked out. David let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his face. Of course she did. That guy is a walking disaster. Are they going to be okay? They will get exactly what they deserve. I replied, stepping forward to wrap my arms around him. Do not worry about them, David. I am going to handle everything. Let us just go back to sleep. I held him tightly, feeling the steady beat of his heart. I promised myself right then and there that no one would ever use my husband's name for their dirty work and get away with it. I barely slept that night. My mind was racing, compiling data, preparing for the war I was about to wage from behind my encrypted computer screens. The sun eventually rose, casting a pale gray light through our bedroom window. I slipped out of bed, made a strong cup of black coffee, and prepared to start my investigation. But my family was not done with me yet. They wanted to make sure I was completely under their thumb. At exactly 8 in the morning, the heavy wooden front door of our house vibrated with 3 loud, aggressive knocks. I set my coffee mug on the kitchen counter. I walked to the entryway and looked through the peephole. Standing on my front porch was an uninvited guest wearing a smug expression and radiating an arrogant attitude that told me the real game had just begun. The heavy wooden front door vibrated with 3 loud, aggressive knocks. I set my coffee mug on the kitchen counter, walked to the entryway, and looked through the peephole. Standing on my porch was my father, Thomas. He wore a crisp, custom-tailored suit, looking perfectly put together for a man who had spent the entire night covering up a federal crime. I swung the door open and he pushed past me without waiting for an invitation. He walked straight into my living room, exuding an air of complete arrogant authority. Before I could even speak, he reached inside his designer jacket, pulled out a thick white envelope, and tossed it onto my glass coffee table. It landed with a heavy, distinct thud. "Take that and go shopping," my father commanded, adjusting his expensive tie. "There is $5,000 in cash in there. I suggest you buy yourself a decent dress, and maybe treat your husband to a suit that does not look like it came off a discount rack." I stared at the envelope, my face perfectly blank. $5,000. That was the price tag he was putting on my silence. They had stolen my husband's identity to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical care, and my father truly believed he could buy my complicity with pocket change. Thomas took a step closer, his voice dropping into a harsh, authoritative tone. You are going to keep your mouth completely shut about last night. Do you understand me? Next week, Donovan is being discharged from the hospital. To celebrate his miraculous recovery, your mother and I are hosting a massive charity gala at our estate. The entire country club board will be there. Donovan's top-tier investors will be there. You and your husband will attend, you will smile, and you will dress appropriately, so you do not embarrass this family. I did not even get a chance to formulate a reply before heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. David walked into the living room, a towel draped over his shoulder, fresh out of the shower. He had heard every single word. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles ticked in his cheeks. David is a patient man, a gentle guy who designs serene landscapes for a living. But seeing a man disrespect his wife in their own home was his absolute limit. Get out of my house, David said, his voice dangerously low. He stepped forward, putting himself directly between my father and me. You do not come into my home, throw dirty money on my table, and speak to my wife like she is your employee. Take your envelope and get out right now. My father did not flinch. Instead, Thomas tilted his head back and let out a short, condescending laugh. He looked at David the way one might look at a stray dog that had wandered onto a pristine golf course. You should be getting down on your knees and thanking God this family even allowed you to step foot inside it. Thomas sneered, his eyes filled with absolute disdain. Who do you think you are talking to? If it were not for the referrals I threw your way, how would your little gardening business ever get any clients? You plant bushes for a living, David. You are a glorified lawn boy. You need us. We do not need you. The air in the room grew instantly volatile. David took another step forward, his hands balling into fists at his sides. I knew my husband. He was seconds away from physically throwing my father out the front door. That would give my family exactly what they wanted, a chaotic domestic incident they could use to paint us as the unstable, violent ones. It would muddy the waters and distract the authorities from their massive federal crimes. I could not let that happen. I needed clean, undisputed evidence. I needed them to feel completely invincible. I reached out and grabbed David's forearm. I squeezed it firmly, sending a silent, urgent message. He looked back at me, his eyes full of confusion and betrayal, wondering why I was stopping him. I stepped around my husband and picked up the white envelope from the coffee table. I held the cash in my hands, looking directly into my father's arrogant eyes. I forced the corners of my mouth to curve upward into a practiced, compliant smile. Thank you, Dad, I said, keeping my voice soft and submissive. We appreciate the generosity. We will make sure to buy something appropriate for the gala next week. Tell Mom and Morgan we will be there. Thomas looked incredibly smug. He nodded slowly, satisfied that he had once again put the scapegoat daughter back in her rightful place. That is a smart girl, Lauren, he said, turning toward the entryway. See that you do not forget your place again. I walked him to the door, maintaining my pleasant expression. I watched him walk down the driveway, get into his luxury sedan, and drive away. The second his car disappeared around the corner, the pleasant smile melted completely off my face. I closed the front door and locked the deadbolt. When I turned around, David was staring at me as if I were a total stranger, his chest heaving with barely suppressed anger. Are you just going to let this go? David demanded, his voice thick with frustration. Lauren, he just insulted us in our own home. He threw hush money at you. What exactly did Morgan do last night that requires $5,000 of silence? Why are you letting them treat us like garbage? I walked past him, heading straight down the hallway toward the spare bedroom at the back of the house. For the entirety of our marriage, my family believed this room was just a simple home office where I crunched mundane numbers and filed boring tax returns. David knew I worked hard, but even he did not know the full classified extent of the federal investigations I handled. I stopped in front of the heavy reinforced door of my home office. I placed my thumb on the biometric fingerprint scanner embedded in the lock. A soft electronic chime echoed in the hallway, and the heavy deadbolt clicked open. I pushed the door wide open and turned on the overhead lights. Inside, the room hummed with the quiet power of a high-end encrypted server tower. My custom-built workstation sat in the center, featuring 3 massive high-resolution monitors connected to restricted financial databases. It was a digital war room built to track money laundering, offshore accounts, and corporate embezzlement. I turned to look at my husband, dropping the envelope of cash onto my desk. "I am not letting anything go, David," I said, my voice steady and cold with absolute resolve. "Morgan did not just ask me to lie last night. She stole your social security number to admit Donovan into the hospital. They committed medical identity theft and wire fraud." David's eyes widened in pure shock. He looked at the massive workstation, then back at me, finally grasping the gravity of the situation. "They think they bought my silence for $5,000. I continued, booting up my encrypted network. "They think I am just a quiet, obedient data entry clerk who will roll over and take their abuse. It is time they learn exactly what your wife actually does for a living." I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair and let my fingers fly across the illuminated keyboard. The 3 massive monitors flickered to life, casting a cold blue glow across the darkened room. David stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the complex array of encrypted software and federal database portals populating my screens. He had always known I worked in finance, but seeing the actual tools of a senior forensic investigator was an entirely different reality. I bypassed the standard commercial credit checks. Those take days to update and only show the surface-level damage. Instead, I logged into the proprietary tracking systems my firm uses to hunt down offshore tax evaders and corporate embezzlers. I entered my secure credentials, routed my connection through our encrypted servers, and typed in David's social security number. I hit the enter key and waited for the algorithm to pull every single financial footprint tied to his identity across the entire country. The system took exactly 14 seconds to aggregate the data. When the main screen populated with a sprawling web of red flags, my blood ran absolutely cold. I pointed to a freshly filed auto lease agreement originating from a luxury dealership downtown. "Look at this," I said, my voice steady, despite the anger surging through my veins. "The Porsche Donovan crashed last night into that concrete barrier. He did not buy it with his multi-million-dollar real estate funds. He leased it 2 weeks ago, and he used your name, your pristine credit score, and your social security number to drive it off the lot." David leaned closer to the monitor, his face turning pale. "He leased a $150,000 sports car in my name," he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of shock and pure rage. "How is that even possible without me being there?" I pulled up the digital signatures attached to the dealer contract. I zoomed in on the scanned driver's license they used for the background check. It was David's information perfectly replicated, but the photograph on the counterfeit ID was Donovan. They had orchestrated a highly sophisticated identity theft ring right under our noses. "My mother probably supplied the tax documents they needed to verify your employment history," I explained calmly, tracing the digital paper trail. "Morgan has always been manipulative, but this takes extreme calculation. They needed a spotless credit profile to maintain their fake billionaire lifestyle, and yours was sitting right there in my parents' filing cabinet. But the stolen sports car was just the beginning of the nightmare." I opened a secondary window and ran a deep diagnostic on all newly opened lines of credit tied to David's profile over the past 12 months. The screen flooded with a cascade of unauthorized accounts. My heart pounded against my ribs as I scrolled through the devastating list. 5 high-tier premium credit cards had been opened in the last 6 months alone. I clicked on the transaction histories, watching a sickening story of greed and entitlement unfold in real time. Morgan and Donovan had not just borrowed money. They had systematically bled David's identity dry to fund their entire fraudulent existence. I highlighted a series of transactions from last month. Look at these charges, David. They maxed out a $30,000 limit on a single card in less than 3 weeks. They bought designer clothes at high-end boutiques, booked first-class flights for their weekend getaways, and paid for extravagant dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants. They even charged their exclusive country club membership dues to your name. Every single time my parents bragged about Donovan's massive success and his luxurious lifestyle, they were actually bragging about stolen money. It got worse. I shifted my focus to the cash advance histories. Donovan was not just buying material goods, he was actively draining liquid cash. I tracked multiple ATM withdrawals and wire transfers routed to a secondary shell account. He had pulled over $40,000 in pure cash advances using David's stolen credit lines. David gripped the edge of my desk, his knuckles turning white. He looked like he was about to physically explode. "We are calling the police right now, Lauren," he demanded, his voice echoing in the quiet office. "I am not paying for their luxury vacations. I am not taking the fall for a crashed Porsche. I am going to have him arrested in his hospital bed." I immediately stood up and placed my hands firmly on his shoulders, forcing him to look me in the eyes. "I need you to trust me, David." I said, my tone absolute and unwavering. "If we call the local police department right now, they will treat this as a messy domestic dispute. My parents will hire the most aggressive, expensive defense attorneys they can find. They will claim you gave Donovan permission to use your credit to help his business. They will say it was a family loan that you suddenly decided to revoke. Morgan will cry in front of a judge, play the victim, and they might just walk away with a minor fine and a slap on the wrist. I am not letting them walk away." I turned back to my monitors, my mind operating with lethal precision. They crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. If they want to play high-stakes financial games, I am going to show them what happens when you mess with a forensic auditor. I am not going to call the local cops. I am going to build a comprehensive bulletproof dossier of federal crimes. I am going to track exactly where Donovan funneled those cash advances. I am going to dismantle his fake real estate empire, expose his investors, and hand-wrap this entire criminal enterprise for the FBI and the IRS. When I am done with them, they will not just lose their country club memberships. They will lose their freedom. I cracked my knuckles and typed a new command into the terminal, initiating a deep dive into Donovan's corporate filings. I needed to see the exact structure of his supposed luxury real estate fund to understand how he was washing the stolen money. The progress bar on my screen slowly filled as the federal database compiled the records. The silence in the room was thick with anticipation. Suddenly, the sharp, piercing sound of our front doorbell shattered the quiet concentration of the house. David and I both jumped. I quickly switched one of my monitors to the exterior security camera feed. Standing on our front porch was a man we had never seen before. He wore a cheap suit and held a thick, intimidating manila envelope firmly in his hands. He reached out and pressed the doorbell a second time, looking highly impatient. I zoomed the camera in on the envelope. Printed across the front in bold red ink were the words, "Urgent legal matter." It was a process server, and he was standing at our door loudly demanding that David come outside. I watched the high-definition security feed as the man in the cheap gray suit pressed our doorbell a third consecutive time. David let out a sharp breath that sounded more like a low growl and marched straight down the hallway. I followed closely behind him, my analytical mind already bracing for whatever legal grenade my toxic family had just tossed onto our front porch. David yanked the heavy wooden door open, his posture rigid and defensive. The man on the porch did not ask for a name. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply shoved a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope directly against David's chest. "You have been served," the man stated with absolute mechanical flatness. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked briskly back to his unmarked sedan parked on the street. David tore open the tight seal of the envelope, pulling out a dense stack of legal documents. I watched his eyes scan the bold print on the top page, his expression shifting rapidly from raw anger to absolute paralyzing horror. He handed the papers to me, his hands physically shaking with a mix of rage and disbelief. It was a formal civil lawsuit from a highly aggressive predatory commercial debt collection agency. The plaintiff was suing David for a defaulted business loan. The principal amount listed in bold black ink was $150,000. I took the papers and read through the filing details with cold, clinical precision. The loan had been taken out exactly 8 months ago. The application was processed strictly using David's stolen Social Security number, his previously immaculate credit history, and a meticulously falsified digital signature. But what truly caught my attention was the default date. The very first missed payment aligned perfectly with the exact week Morgan and Donovan started demanding that we attend their upcoming charity gala and pretend our family dynamic was flawlessly perfect. This was not just reckless, impulsive spending by an out-of-control brother-in-law. This was calculated, premeditated blackmail. They deliberately let a massive, high-interest commercial loan go into default under my husband's name. They knew the collection agency would file a lawsuit. If we tried to call the police to blow the whistle on the hospital identity theft, they would let this lawsuit completely destroy our credit score, bankrupt our hard-earned assets, and drag David into years of grueling, expensive litigation. They were holding our entire financial future hostage to ensure we smiled, clapped, and kept our mouths entirely shut at their elite country club parties. David began pacing the hardwood floor of the living room, running his hands furiously through his hair. $150,000, Lauren, he said, his voice cracking under the immense weight of the number. We do not have that kind of liquid cash to fight a corporate legal team. We are going to lose our savings. They are going to put a lien on our house. They are going to completely ruin my landscape architecture business before the spring season even starts. I walked over to the coffee table and dropped the heavy lawsuit directly next to the $5,000 of insulting hush money my father had thrown at us earlier that morning. I looked at David, my voice completely devoid of panic, radiating nothing but absolute certainty. They are not taking our house, David, I told him, holding his panicked gaze. And they are certainly not ruining your business. They just made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. They brought a fraudulent financial lawsuit into the home of a senior forensic investigator. I grabbed his hand and led him straight back into my secure home office, locking the reinforced door behind us. I sat down at my workstation and cracked my knuckles. The anger I felt was no longer a hot, chaotic, emotional mess. It was a cold, laser-focused weapon. If Donovan wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial warfare, I was going to show him exactly how a federal auditor dismantles an opponent brick by brick. I pulled up the commercial loan documents on my encrypted server and immediately cross-referenced the banking routing numbers listed in the lawsuit. I needed to see exactly how Donovan was moving the money he stole. My fingers flew across the illuminated keyboard, pulling deeply buried bank statements, offshore wire transfer logs, and hidden digital payment trails. I effortlessly bypassed the standard commercial security walls, digging straight into the dark financial ecosystem Donovan had built over the last 2 years. For several intense hours, the only sound in the room was the rapid, rhythmic clicking of my keyboard and David's steady, anxious breathing behind my chair. I meticulously traced every single dollar that flowed in and out of the shell accounts tied to Donovan's supposed luxury real estate firm. I looked at how he strategically paid the absolute minimum balances on the stolen credit cards to keep them active just long enough to max them out again. I tracked the flow of the $150,000, watching it bounce through 3 different intermediary banks before landing in a private account. But then my custom tracking algorithm flagged a massive, glaring anomaly. It was a pattern so incredibly reckless and brazen that it made me stop typing completely. I leaned closer to the center monitor, my eyes scanning the data streams. Donovan was making massive, irregular cash deposits into his primary checking account to cover his lavish lifestyle, his expensive tailored suits, and his leased sports cars. But that money was not coming from legitimate property sales. It was not coming from commercial real estate revenue or vetted institutional investors. I aggressively traced the origin of the incoming wire transfers. The names attached to the routing numbers flashed across my screen one by one. Harrison Caldwell, Preston Montgomery, Edward Kensington. My heart pounded against my ribs. I recognized every single one of those names. They were the wealthy elite members of my parents' exclusive country club. They were my father's regular golf buddies and my mother's high society friends. Donovan was taking personal direct wire transfers straight from their private retirement and investment accounts. I commanded the software to zoom in on the complex transaction map, connecting the dots across my three massive screens. A terrifying, monumental truth emerged from the tangled web of data. I checked the state registry for building permits. Zero results. I checked the municipal zoning board for commercial development contracts. Zero results. There were no luxury condominiums being built. There were no commercial real estate acquisitions. There were no construction contracts whatsoever. Donovan's highly praised $30 million real estate empire was completely entirely fake. He was not a brilliant developer. He was a charismatic predator running a massive catastrophic financial scheme, and my parents' wealthy friends were his primary unsuspecting targets. I pointed at the cascading numbers on my center monitor, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. David, this is not just a fake real estate company. This is a textbook multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. David stared at the screen, his eyes tracking the chaotic web of wire transfers I had just mapped out. A Ponzi scheme. He asked, his voice thick with disbelief. You mean he is not building anything at all? Absolutely nothing. I replied, my fingers flying across the keyboard to isolate the largest transactions. Look at the flow of capital. When Donovan receives a massive wire transfer from one of my father's wealthy golf buddies, he does not route that money into a commercial development account. He does not buy land. He does not hire contractors. He takes that fresh influx of cash and uses a fraction of it to pay off the previous investors, labeling it as a quarterly dividend return. He creates the absolute illusion of a highly profitable, thriving enterprise. I opened another encrypted window, tracking the remainder of the stolen funds. And the rest of the money, I continued, my stomach turning with disgust. He funnels it directly into offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands to hide it from domestic tax audits. He uses those hidden accounts to lease the sports cars, buy the designer suits, and fund the lavish vacations that Morgan constantly flaunts on social media. They are living like royalty on stolen retirement funds. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. But the most sickening realization hit me when I looked at the names of the victims: Harrison Caldwell, Preston Montgomery, Edward Kensington. These were not just random, unsuspecting investors. These were the pillars of my parents' elite social circle. My parents did not just turn a blind eye to Donovan's fraud. I said the cold truth washing over me. They actively facilitated it. Thomas and Cynthia are so hopelessly obsessed with status, so desperate to show off their brilliant billionaire son-in-law, that they practically served their own friends to him on a silver platter. They paraded Donovan around the country club, bragging about his exclusive real estate fund, basically doing all the networking and recruiting for his Ponzi scheme. They are his primary marketing team. David gripped the back of my chair, his knuckles white. We have to call the police right now, Lauren. We have the proof. We have the bank records. If we show this to the local authorities, they can arrest him before he steals another dime. I shook my head, immediately shutting down the impulse. No, David. Local police departments are not equipped to handle complex, multi-layered offshore financial crimes. If we call the local cops, they will launch a standard investigation. Morgan and Donovan will catch wind of it immediately. They will liquidate whatever cash is left in those domestic accounts, wire it to a non-extradition country, and absolutely vanish. Or worse, they will use that stolen money to hire a ruthless defense team, tie this case up in litigation for 10 years, and successfully frame you for the entire operation using your stolen identity. I turned my chair to face my husband, my expression hardening into stone. If we want to take down a predator like Donovan, we do not call the local police. We call the apex predators of the financial world. I swiveled back to my workstation and opened a highly secured restricted communication channel. During my years as a forensic accountant, I had collaborated on several massive federal cases. I knew exactly who to contact. I initiated a direct encrypted line to Special Agent Mitchell, a senior investigator at the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Mitchell and I had dismantled a corporate embezzlement ring 2 years ago. He knew my work, and he knew I never cried wolf. I typed out a brief urgent message outlining the framework of the Ponzi scheme, the offshore tax evasion, and the ongoing medical identity theft. I securely packaged the transaction maps, the forged loan documents, and the wire transfer logs, sending them directly to his federal terminal. Within 10 minutes, my secure line illuminated with an incoming call from Mitchell. I put him on speakerphone so David could hear. Lauren Mitchell said, his voice clipped and highly professional. "I am looking at the data packets you just transmitted. If this routing information is accurate, your brother-in-law is running a Grade A federal fraud operation. The tax evasion alone will put him away for a decade." "The data is bulletproof, Mitchell," I replied smoothly. "But we cannot just freeze his accounts. He will run. We need to catch him in the act of actively soliciting and accepting fraudulent funds to secure a wire fraud conviction that will stick permanently. We need to trap him in a public setting with all of his victims present." Mitchell paused for a moment, the sound of keyboard clicking echoing through the speaker. "I can get a federal task force assembled, including agents from the FBI white-collar division. But we need a venue, Lauren. We need a specific event where he is actively pitching this fake fund to investors across state lines." I looked at the $5,000 in hush money my father had thrown on our coffee table earlier that morning. A cold, razor-sharp smile touched my lips. "I think I have the perfect venue," I told the federal agent. "Just give me a few weeks to set the stage." We spent the next hour coordinating the logistics of a massive multi-agency sting operation. David stood by my side, listening as we engineered the absolute destruction of my toxic family. 3 weeks later, the final piece of the puzzle arrived at our doorstep. I walked out to the mailbox and pulled out a thick, glossy envelope made of premium heavy cardstock. I carried it inside and sliced it open with a letter opener. Inside was an ornate gold-embossed invitation. It requested our presence at an exclusive fundraising gala hosted at the sprawling estate of Thomas and Cynthia. The elegant cursive text announced that the lavish event was being held to celebrate Donovan's miraculous recovery from his tragic accident and to officially launch the highly anticipated second phase of his luxury real estate investment fund. I stared at the invitation, my smile widening into something genuinely dangerous. The trap was perfectly set, and my arrogant family was blindly walking right into it. The night of the gala arrived with a crisp, biting chill in the winter air. David and I pulled up to the sprawling iron-gated entrance of my parents' suburban estate. The massive circular driveway was already jammed with an endless parade of luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp white shirts were rushing frantically to park imported sports cars and sleek black sedans. The entire property was illuminated by dramatic theatrical landscaping lights, casting a golden artificial glow over the manicured lawns. It looked exactly like a scene straight out of a high society magazine spread. But as a senior forensic accountant, I did not see glamour or prestige. I saw an active multi-million-dollar crime scene funded entirely by stolen retirement accounts, wire fraud, and identity theft. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothing down the fabric of my tailored navy dress, and stepped out of the car. David walked closely beside me, his hand resting warmly on the small of my back. His presence a steady grounding force amidst the absolute circus of my toxic family. We barely made it past the grand marble foyer before my mother intercepted us like a heavily armed guard. Cynthia materialized from a crowd of wealthy guests holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne. She wore an extravagant floor-length sequined gown that sparkled aggressively under the massive crystal chandelier. Her eyes raked over my simple, elegant dress with undisguised bitter contempt. "I explicitly told you to buy something appropriate with that cash your father gave you, Lauren. Cynthia hissed, stepping directly into my path to physically block me from entering the main ballroom. Did you find that boring little outfit on a clearance rack at a discount outlet? You look like you are heading to a dull corporate board meeting, not a luxury fundraising gala. David stiffened beside me, his jaw clenching, but I squeezed his hand tightly, signaling him to stand down and stick to the plan. Cynthia leaned in closer, her expensive perfume suffocating the air between us, her voice dropping to a harsh, commanding whisper. The local business press is here tonight taking photos for the society pages. Do not embarrass this family with your pathetic middle-class aesthetic. I want you and your gardener husband to stay entirely away from the media area. Go stand by the buffet in the back, keep your mouths shut, and do not even think about speaking to Donovan's VIP investors. I offered her a perfectly polite, completely hollow smile. Of course, Mom, I replied smoothly, my voice devoid of any emotion. We would hate to ruin your perfect, highly curated pictures. She gave me one last look of utter disgust before turning on her heel to greet a group of wealthy country club wives, her fake dazzling smile instantly returning to her face. David and I walked into the main ballroom, and the sheer scale of the fraudulent operation was breathtaking. An elegant string quartet played classical music in the corner. Waiters in tailored vests carried silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne through the crowd. In the absolute center of the room, surrounded by an eager, fawning crowd of elite investors, sat Donovan. He was positioned in a top-of-the-line motorized leather wheelchair, playing the role of the brave, tragic survivor to absolute perfection. His leg was propped up in a pristine white cast, and he wore a custom-tailored suit jacket draped meticulously over his shoulders to accommodate his medical bandages. He was laughing warmly, telling heroic, entirely fabricated stories about swerving his sports car to avoid hitting a stray animal on the dark highway. He completely omitted the fact that he was driving a stolen, unregistered Porsche while heavily intoxicated, and that the hospital bill for his tragic injuries was currently sitting under my husband's stolen Social Security number. The wealthy guests were practically throwing their sympathy and their thick checkbooks directly into his lap. As I watched this sickening theatrical display of manipulation, Morgan suddenly glided past me. She was draped in a breathtaking crimson silk dress that clung perfectly to her figure, a dress undoubtedly purchased with David's stolen credit line. She held a full glass of dark red wine. As she brushed past my shoulder, she deliberately tilted her wrist. A heavy splash of Merlot cascaded directly onto the front of my tailored navy dress, leaving a massive, glaring stain rapidly spreading across the fabric. Oops, my mistake. Morgan laughed loudly, her voice piercing the ambient noise of the room, ensuring several nearby guests turned around to watch my public humiliation. Her eyes gleamed with that familiar, predatory malice she had honed since childhood. This feels exactly like the time I accidentally tripped and tore your senior prom dress right before your date arrived in high school, does it not? You just have such incredibly bad luck, big sister. She smirked, crossing her arms, waiting for me to cry, to yell, or to run out of the room in tears, just like I did when we were vulnerable teenagers. She wanted to break me down and put me right back in my place as the designated family punching bag. What Morgan did not know, what her arrogant, parasitic mind could not possibly comprehend, was that the sleek black leather clutch I was gripping tightly in my right hand contained an encrypted military-grade flash drive. That tiny digital device held the comprehensive, irrefutable dossiers I had prepared exclusively for the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. It contained every forged loan document, every offshore wire transfer routing number, and the absolute concrete proof of her massive federal crimes. She was standing there gloating about ruining my cheap dress, completely unaware that I was holding the exact instrument that was going to send her to a federal penitentiary for the next decade. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I did not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I calmly picked up a white cloth napkin from a passing waiter's tray and blotted the spilled wine from my dress with slow, deliberate precision. I dropped the stained napkin onto a side table, locked my eyes onto the center of the room, and walked straight toward Donovan and his crowd of millionaire investors. I walked straight toward the center of the grand ballroom, ignoring the hushed whispers of the wealthy guests, who noticed the glaring red wine stain on my dress. I let my shoulders slump just a fraction. I adjusted my posture to look exactly like the defeated, desperate woman they all believed me to be. Donovan was holding court from his luxurious leather wheelchair surrounded by men in tailored tuxedos and women dripping in diamonds. He was right in the middle of a charismatic pitch to Harrison Caldwell, one of my father's wealthiest golf partners. I stopped at the edge of his inner circle and waited for a lull in the conversation. When Donovan paused to take a sip of his sparkling water, I stepped forward. I made sure my hands were trembling slightly as I clutched my small black purse. "Donovan," I said, keeping my voice soft, hesitant, and laced with absolute desperation. "I am so sorry to interrupt your important conversations, but I really need to ask you for a massive favor." Donovan turned his head, his eyes scanning my stained dress with poorly concealed disgust. The wealthy investors surrounding him fell silent, watching the awkward family interaction unfold. Donovan clearly relished the audience. He sat up straighter in his wheelchair, puffing out his chest, ready to play the benevolent, successful billionaire relative. "What is it, Lauren?" he asked, his tone dripping with extreme condescension. "As you can see, I am in the middle of securing capital for Phase 2 of my luxury condominium project. Time is money." I looked down at the polished marble floor, playing my role to absolute perfection. "David and I are struggling," I whispered, but I made sure my voice carried clearly enough for Mr. Caldwell and the other VIP guests to hear every single word. "The economy has been so hard on David's landscaping business, and my little bookkeeping job barely covers our mortgage anymore. We are running out of money, Donovan. We managed to scrape together $50,000 from our emergency life savings. It is everything we have left. Please, can you let me invest it into your real estate fund? We desperately need the return on investment just to stay afloat." A heavy silence blanketed the immediate area. I could see the profound pity on the faces of my parents' wealthy friends. But Donovan did not look pitying. He looked absolutely euphoric. The golden son-in-law was finally being begged for financial salvation by the pathetic, struggling older sister. It was the ultimate ego boost. Donovan threw his head back and let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed across the ballroom. He looked around at his elite investors, gesturing toward me with a wide, theatrical sweep of his hand. "Listen to this," Donovan announced, making sure his voice projected to the entire crowd. "My sister-in-law sits in a cubicle doing basic data entry all day, and now she wants to play in the big leagues. Lauren, you do not know the first thing about high-yield commercial real estate investments. You probably do not even understand how a basic dividend works. My fund usually requires a minimum buy-in of $500,000. Your $50,000 is absolute pocket change." I forced tears to well up in my eyes, biting my lower lip. "Please, Donovan," I begged, letting my voice crack perfectly. "You are our only hope." Donovan soaked in the admiring gazes of the audience. He sighed dramatically, playing the role of the generous, forgiving family patriarch. "Well, I suppose we have to take care of our own," he said, dripping with fake charity. "I will make a special exception for you, Lauren. Consider it a family favor." He snapped his fingers at one of his assistants standing nearby. The assistant quickly handed him a sleek leather folder. Donovan pulled out a thick, legally binding contribution agreement and shoved it toward me along with a gold-plated pen. "Here is the investment contract," Donovan said, his voice loud and incredibly arrogant. "Read it carefully so you do not get confused by all the big financial words. Sign the bottom line, and you can wire the funds directly into my corporate holding account." I took the pen with shaking hands. I looked down at the fraudulent document. It was a masterpiece of financial deception, promising guaranteed quarterly returns on non-existent luxury properties. I did not need to read it. I already knew every single lie printed on those pages. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name on the dotted line. I pulled my smartphone from my purse. I opened my banking application. But this was not my personal checking account. This was a highly restricted, heavily monitored portal directly linked to the federal task force. The $50,000 sitting in that account was federal bait money meticulously tracked and cataloged by the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I typed in the routing number Donovan had provided on his fraudulent contract. I entered the exact amount: $50,000. I looked up at Donovan, who was watching me with greedy, predatory eyes. I pressed the transfer button. A second later, a sharp, distinct chime echoed from the phone resting in Donovan's suit pocket. The notification had arrived. The money had officially landed in his account. Donovan smiled, a massive, victorious grin spreading across his face as he checked his screen. He truly believed he had just stolen the last remaining life savings of his pathetic sister-in-law. I lowered my phone, and the terrified, desperate expression completely vanished from my face. The corners of my mouth curled upward into a slow, razor-sharp smile. The moment that money crossed state lines and entered his offshore routing network, the trap snapped shut. The act of federal wire fraud was officially complete, and my brother-in-law had just signed his own ticket to federal prison. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing their classical melodies, replaced by the sharp, authoritative clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute. The low hum of wealthy chatter instantly died down. The grand ballroom fell into an expectant, heavy silence as a bright spotlight illuminated the raised mahogany stage at the far end of the room. My father, Thomas, stepped up to the podium. He adjusted the lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo, puffing out his chest, as he looked over the sea of elite investors, country club executives, and local socialites. He tapped the microphone, the harsh feedback echoing off the vaulted ceilings, ensuring he commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas began, his voice booming with arrogant authority. "Thank you all for gathering in our home tonight. We are here to celebrate resilience, brilliance, and above all, family." He gestured grandly toward the center of the room, where Donovan sat perfectly positioned in his luxurious leather wheelchair, soaking up the spotlight like a sponge. "Many of you know my son-in-law Donovan." Thomas continued, his tone dripping with profound admiration. "You know him as a financial visionary, a titan of luxury real estate, the man who is single-handedly transforming the skyline of our beautiful city with his $30 million Phase 2 project." The crowd erupted into polite, eager applause. The very people whose retirement accounts were currently being drained to fund Donovan's leased sports cars were clapping for their own financial executioner. My mother, Cynthia, stood near the front row, dabbing at her completely dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She was playing the role of the overwhelmed, proud matriarch to absolute perfection. But recently, Thomas lowered his voice to a dramatic, false somberness. "We almost lost him to a tragic accident. Yet, like everything Donovan does, he fought back. He survived. He emerged victorious. And standing right beside him through it all is my youngest daughter, Morgan. She is the perfect wife, the perfect daughter, and the absolute pride and joy of this family. She represents everything we stand for." Morgan smiled demurely, resting her hand on Donovan's shoulder, posing perfectly for the local society photographers, flashing their cameras nearby. Then my father scanned the massive room. His eyes swept over the glittering crowd until they locked onto me and David, standing near the back shadows by the catering tables. A patronizing, deeply cruel smile spread across his weathered face. He leaned closer to the microphone, preparing to deliver the ultimate public humiliation. "Of course, family is also about charity," Thomas announced, his voice echoing loudly. "It is about lifting up those who perhaps have not reached the same heights of success, those who have stumbled." He pointed his index finger directly at me. The spotlight operator, taking the cue, swung a blinding beam of light across the room, illuminating my stained dress for all to see. The entire ballroom turned around to stare. "My eldest daughter Lauren is here tonight," Thomas said, projecting a tone of fake syrupy pity. "As many of you know, her career has been somewhat lackluster. She sits in a boring gray cubicle typing numbers into a computer. She lives a very modest, simple life with her husband, who makes an honest living planting trees and laying sod in other people's yards. Muffled chuckles and gasps of secondhand embarrassment rippled through the elite crowd. I stared straight back at my father, my face an unreadable mask of stone. "But in this family we take care of our own," Thomas declared proudly, "even when they struggle to keep up, even when they fail to meet our high standards." Just moments ago, Donovan, in his boundless generosity, agreed to let Lauren invest her meager, desperate little life savings into his elite corporate fund. He did not need her pennies. It is absolute pocket change to a man of his stature. But he took her money anyway, just to give her a tiny taste of real success. That is the kind of incredible man he is. That is the kind of forgiving, wealthy family we are. The room broke into thunderous applause. The rich elites raised their expensive champagne flutes to toast Donovan's incredible mercy. They looked back at me with absolute, undisguised pity, viewing me as the pathetic charity case sister who was graciously being allowed to eat the scraps falling from Donovan's table. I could feel the heavy weight of their collective judgment, but it meant absolutely nothing to me. Because I knew something they did not. I knew they were clapping for a ghost empire. Beside me, David went completely rigid. His entire body was trembling with a violently suppressed explosive rage. His hand gripped mine so hard, my knuckles were turning white. The heat radiating off him was palpable. I could hear his rapid, shallow breathing cutting through the deafening applause of the crowd. He was seconds away from snapping. He was ready to charge through that crowd sprint up those mahogany stairs and tear the microphone from my father's hands by sheer physical force. David leaned down his voice, a dangerous low growl against my ear. "I am going to break his jaw. I do not care if I go to jail for assault, Lauren. I am ending this right now." I turned my head and looked up at my husband. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear of embarrassment. I simply took my free hand and gently patted the back of his rigid, clenched fist. My eyes met his, radiating the absolute, terrifying calm of a federal auditor who had just locked the vault doors. "No, David." I whispered, my voice smooth and lethal as shattered glass. "You are not going to jail. They are." I glanced down at the encrypted smartphone resting quietly in my palm. A single silent green notification flashed across the dark screen from Special Agent Mitchell. The federal wire transfer had officially cleared the international banking protocol. The $50,000 of bait money was securely locked in Donovan's offshore trap. The geographical perimeter was fully secured by law enforcement. The operation was a go. I looked back up at the stage where my father was still standing at the podium, basking blindly in the glow of his own arrogant lies. I squeezed David's hand one last time and let it go. "Countdown." I whispered under my breath, my eyes locked on my father. 3, 2, 1. I straightened my shoulders, standing impossibly tall despite the glaring red wine stain Morgan had intentionally thrown on my dress. I stepped away from the shadows of the buffet table and walked directly down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The wealthy guests parted like the Red Sea, falling silent as they stared at me in absolute shock. I did not rush. I did not run. I walked with the slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps of an executioner arriving at the gallows. I reached the mahogany stairs. I ascended them without breaking eye contact with my father for a single millisecond. Thomas opened his mouth to scold me, his face twisting into an ugly, furious scowl at my insubordination, but he did not even get the chance to speak. I stepped right up to the podium, reached out my hand, and violently snatched the microphone straight out of his grip. The harsh screech of audio feedback pierced the grand ballroom as my fingers wrapped tightly around the cold metal of the microphone. I yanked it from my father's hands with a sudden, deliberate force that made him stumble backward in his expensive tuxedo. Thomas stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated fury and utter confusion. For my entire life, this man had meticulously controlled the family narrative. He dictated who was deemed successful, who was labeled a failure, and who was allowed to speak at his elite social gatherings. Not tonight. Tonight I was the one holding the microphone, and I was fully prepared to burn his carefully constructed illusions to the ground. "Thank you, Dad." I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The superior acoustics of the ballroom amplified my cold, unwavering tone, making sure not a single syllable was lost. I looked out over the sea of wealthy investors, country club executives, and local socialites. I appreciate that deeply touching speech about our family. The generosity and fierce protection this family provides are truly unparalleled. In fact, the protection is so profound, so deeply selfless, that my brother-in-law Donovan generously decided to protect his own bank account by completely taking over my husband's social security number. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the room. The polite clinking of champagne glasses stopped instantly. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with sudden, uncomfortable tension. I locked eyes with Donovan, who was sitting in his luxurious leather wheelchair in the center of the crowd. The arrogant, untouchable smirk had totally vanished from his face. His dark skin paled, his jaw dropping open as the reality of my words hit him. Morgan, standing right beside him in her stolen crimson dress, looked like she had just been struck by lightning. Yes, you heard me correctly. I continued, projecting my voice so every single VIP investor could hear the raw, unvarnished truth. When Donovan crashed his unregistered sports car into a concrete median, while heavily intoxicated last week, he did not use his own name at the emergency room. He did not use his own insurance policy. Instead, he and my perfect sister Morgan committed federal medical identity theft. They admitted him into the intensive care unit under the name David Collins. They illegally forged my electronic signature to authorize a highly complex, incredibly expensive surgery. They seamlessly passed a $350,000 hospital bill directly onto our names all, so Donovan could sit here tonight and pretend to be a wealthy, responsible visionary without a single blemish on his record. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and explosive. The polished elite guests began murmuring in shock, exchanging horrified, suspicious glances with one another. This was no longer a minor family squabble or a simple misunderstanding. This was a highly public, highly detailed accusation of a major felony. My mother, Cynthia, absolutely lost her mind. The sophisticated, polite matriarch persona she had spent decades perfecting completely shattered into pieces. Her face turned an ugly mottled shade of red. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at the stage and let out a piercing, desperate shriek that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "Turn off her microphone right now!" Cynthia screamed, her voice shrill and frantic. "She is lying. She is a jealous, unstable, bitter woman trying to ruin her sister's special night. Security, get up there and drag her off the stage. Throw her out of my house immediately." Two large, burly private security guards hired for the gala immediately stepped forward from the perimeter of the dining area. They moved aggressively toward the mahogany stairs leading up to the podium, their expressions serious as they prepared to physically remove me. But before their polished black shoes could even touch the first step, a tall, imposing figure blocked their path entirely. David stepped out of the shadows and planted his feet firmly at the base of the stage. My husband, the man my family constantly ridiculed as a lowly gardener, squared his broad shoulders. He did not yell. He did not throw a punch or create a chaotic scene. He simply looked at the two large guards with the cold, immovable resolve of a man defending his wife. "You are not taking another step," David stated, his voice low, steady, and vibrating with absolute authority. "If you lay a single finger on her, I promise you will need an ambulance of your own. Stand down." The security guards hesitated. They looked at David, sizing up his solid build, and the dangerous, unwavering look in his eyes. Then they looked back at my father, who was too paralyzed by shock and public embarrassment to give them a direct, coherent order. The guards took a slow step back, silently deciding that a physical altercation in front of 50 millionaire investors was well above their pay grade. David held his ground, turning his head slightly to look up at me. He gave me a single solid nod. The floor was entirely mine. I turned my attention back to the massive audience. The elite investors who had just poured their retirement money into Donovan's fund were no longer looking at me with pity or amusement. They were looking at Donovan with dawning, terrible suspicion. The illusion of the billionaire genius was cracking rapidly, but I was not just going to crack it. I was going to shatter it into a million irreparable pieces. I reached into my small black clutch and pulled out a sleek, encrypted USB drive. It was silver and heavy, containing months of painstaking forensic financial investigations, bank statements, and federal tracking logs. Right next to the podium sat the presentation laptop Donovan had prepared to showcase his fake real estate portfolio. I walked over to the laptop and smoothly inserted the drive into the port. I tapped the keyboard with practiced precision, routing my encrypted files directly to the massive high-definition projector screen hanging behind me. I turned back to the microphone, looking directly at the wealthy country club members who had wired their life savings into a black hole. Thank you all for witnessing my family's incredible charity. I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy toxic tension in the ballroom. But I think it is time we move on to the main event of the evening. Would you all like to see what Donovan's $30 million luxury real estate project actually looks like? The massive high-definition projector screen behind me flickered to life, casting a stark, blinding white light over the sea of elegant guests. The investors and socialites craned their necks, expecting to see glossy architectural renderings of $30 million condominiums. They expected infinity pools, marble lobbies, and sweeping skyline views. Instead, the screen displayed a gritty, high-resolution traffic camera photograph captured at exactly 1:14 in the morning on the night of the crash. I stepped to the side of the podium, allowing the entire ballroom an unobstructed view. The photograph was undeniable. It showed the shattered front end of the luxury sports car wrapped violently around a concrete median. But more importantly, the flash of the automated traffic camera had illuminated the interior of the vehicle with absolute brutal clarity. There, sitting in the driver's seat with his hands gripping the steering wheel and his face twisted in panic, was Donovan. There was no stray animal on the dark highway. I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocated silence of the room. There was just a man driving at 90 miles an hour under the influence. But please direct your attention to the document displayed right next to the photograph. I clicked the presentation remote in my hand. A scanned copy of the official dealership lease agreement appeared on the right side of the massive screen. I had used a digital highlighter to draw a bright yellow box around the lessee information. The elite crowd squinted, reading the text. A collective murmur of shock rippled through the ballroom as they processed the glaring discrepancy. The billionaire real estate mogul sitting in the center of this room did not purchase that vehicle. I stated, looking directly into the horrified faces of my parents' wealthy country club friends. He did not even lease it under his own name. That legally binding contract was finalized using the stolen identity, the pristine credit score, and the social security number of my husband, David Collins. The signature at the bottom is a complete amateur forgery. Donovan shrank back into his plush leather wheelchair. The confident, charismatic hero persona melted off his face, instantly replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a cornered criminal. The investors standing closest to him instinctively took a physical step backward, creating a wide, isolating circle around his wheelchair. They were looking at him not as a financial visionary, but as a dangerous liability. My father Thomas stood frozen near the edge of the stage. His mouth was slightly open, his face drained of all its pompous color. He was completely paralyzed, entirely unable to spin this disaster. Cynthia gripped the edge of a catering table to keep from collapsing, her eyes darting frantically around the room, watching her precious social status evaporate in real time. But I was not finished. A stolen car lease was merely the appetizer. Now, I know some of you might be thinking this is just a family misunderstanding. I continued, keeping my tone deadly calm and entirely professional. You might think I am just a jealous, bitter sister making wild accusations. So let us not rely on my word. Let us listen to Morgan explain the situation herself. I clicked the remote a second time. The traffic camera image vanished, replaced by a stark, pulsing digital audio waveform. I had synced the presentation laptop directly to the ballroom state of the art surround sound system. I pressed play. The crisp, undeniable recording of Morgan's voice boomed from the massive speakers filling every single corner of the extravagant room. "Go ahead and call them Lauren." Morgan's recorded voice taunted, dripping with vicious, arrogant malice. "Tell the police everything. But before you do, you should know that I already used David's social security number to admit Donovan 2 hours ago." The audience audibly gasped. Several older women covered their mouths in pure shock. I let the audio continue to play, forcing my family to listen to their own toxic arrogance broadcast to their most valued peers. "I used the hospital tablet to forge your electronic signature on the consent and financial liability forms." The recording blared relentlessly. "If you call the cops now and claim identity theft, it becomes your word against mine. The police will look at the insurance payout and they will immediately charge you and David as co-conspirators in a federal insurance fraud ring. You have absolutely no way out, big sister. You are going to shut your mouth, go back to your little house, and let my husband get the surgery he needs." The audio file ended with a sharp, definitive click. The deafening silence that crashed over the ballroom was absolute. The elite guests stared at Morgan in sheer, unadulterated horror. She had just confessed to multiple federal felonies on a crystal-clear audio recording. She had admitted to blackmailing her own sister, forging medical documents, and committing severe identity theft to cover up a drunk driving accident. The perfect golden daughter my parents had spent the entire evening praising was exposed as a ruthless, calculating felon. Morgan's face turned an ashen, sickly shade of gray. The blood entirely drained from her cheeks. Her eyes were wide, darting wildly around the room like a trapped animal realizing the cage door had just locked. The panic finally broke through her frozen shock. She let out a guttural, frantic scream that sounded completely unhinged. "Turn it off!" Morgan shrieked, her voice cracking hysterically. She hiked up the skirt of her stolen crimson designer dress and lunged violently toward the mahogany stage. Her high heels scrambled frantically against the polished floor. She charged up the steps with her hands outstretched, her manicured claws aimed directly at the presentation laptop sitting on the podium. She was desperate to smash the computer, to rip the cables out, to destroy the evidence, playing out her destruction. She never even made it to the top step. David moved with the lightning-fast reflexes of a man who had been waiting for this exact moment. He stepped directly into her path, placing himself like a solid brick wall between my sister and the podium. As Morgan threw herself forward, David raised his hands and delivered a firm, forceful shove to her shoulders. He did not strike her, but the sheer momentum of her chaotic charge met the immovable force of his defense. Morgan let out a sharp yelp as she was thrown backward off balance. Her expensive heels twisted beneath her, and she went sprawling hard onto the carpeted floor below the stage. She landed in a tangled, humiliating heap, her stolen designer dress riding up her thighs, her perfectly styled hair falling into a messy, frantic tangle across her face. David stood over her, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his eyes burning with absolute protective fury. "Do not even think about taking another step toward my wife," he warned her, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that carried to the front row of the horrified audience. Morgan scrambled backward on the floor, breathing heavily, looking up at David in sheer terror. She realized in that exact moment that her physical intimidation tactics were entirely useless. She was completely powerless. I did not even flinch at the chaos unfolding at my feet. I stood tall at the podium, looking down at my sister writhing on the carpet, then shifted my gaze to Donovan shrinking in his wheelchair. They thought the worst part was over. They thought medical identity theft was the grand finale of my presentation. They were so incredibly wrong. I gripped the edges of the wooden podium and offered a chilling, perfectly composed smile to the silent, captive audience. I raised the remote control in my right hand, pointing it directly at the projector. "Now that we have established exactly what kind of people my sister and her husband truly are," I announced smoothly, "let us take a deep dive into where all of your hard-earned investment money has actually been going." I pressed the button, advancing the presentation directly to slide 3. The click of the presentation remote echoed like a gunshot through the microphone. Slide 3 materialized on the massive projector screen, painting the faces of the terrified elite guests in a harsh, glaring white light. There were no architectural renderings. There were no blueprints for luxury high-rises, no glossy promotional photos of infinity pools, and no marble lobbies. Instead, the screen displayed a massive, complex digital map composed of bold red lines connecting domestic checking accounts to a labyrinth of offshore banking institutions. For years, my parents have stood in this very room and told you all that I was just a lowly data entry clerk. I announced, my voice ringing with absolute chilling authority that demanded total silence. They told you I was a minor disappointment who sat in a gray cubicle crunching basic numbers for a mediocre salary. They lied to you. Allow me to properly introduce myself to this assembly. I am a senior financial fraud investigator for the global accounting firm, KPMG. My daily job is to dismantle corporate embezzlement rings, track illicit offshore wire transfers, and assist federal agencies in prosecuting high-level financial predators. The collective gasp that sucked the air out of the grand ballroom was deafening. I looked directly at my father. Thomas had physically staggered backward, bumping hard into a caterer's table. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His mouth opened and closed in absolute paralyzing shock, but no words came out. Cynthia stood frozen next to him, her hands trembling violently as the realization finally hit her. The daughter they had mocked, belittled, and treated like an absolute failure was actually an apex predator in the exact financial world they worshipped. I turned my focus back to the wealthy crowd of investors. I raised my hand and pointed directly at the sprawling web of red lines illuminated on the screen behind me. You are currently looking at the unredacted certified financial cash flow of Donovan's supposed luxury real estate investment fund, I stated, projecting my voice to reach the very back of the room. I need you all to listen to me very carefully. There are no high-rise condominiums being built in this city. There are no commercial building permits filed with the zoning board. There are no legitimate property acquisitions in his portfolio. Your golden boy is running a textbook multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. The silence in the room was no longer just shocked. It was suffocating, thick with the dawning catastrophic realization of financial ruin. Every single dollar you wired into his corporate accounts was instantly cannibalized. I continued driving the final lethal nail into the coffin of his fake empire. Donovan took your fresh capital and used a tiny fraction of it to pay off the earlier investors, aggressively labeling those transactions as quarterly dividend returns. He did this to create the absolute illusion of a thriving, highly profitable enterprise, so you would open your checkbooks even wider. But the vast majority of your money never went into real estate. It was systematically laundered through 3 different domestic shell companies before being wired directly into hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I clicked the remote one more time. A giant, highly magnified bank statement appeared on the screen. It displayed the primary operating account for Donovan's $30 million corporate fund, completely unredacted for everyone to see. As of 8 o'clock this morning, I announced, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving register. The primary corporate account for this entire real estate empire holds exactly $12.40. A woman in the second row let out a sharp, genuine cry of profound distress. A heavy crystal champagne flute slipped from an older gentleman's hand and shattered violently against the marble floor, the sharp noise echoing through the frozen crowd. Over $5 million of your personal retirement funds, your children's college savings, and your investment capital have been completely wiped out, I said, staring directly at Harrison Caldwell, my father's wealthiest golf partner. Donovan did not build luxury properties. He used your millions to lease sports cars under my husband's stolen identity. He used your millions to buy Morgan a closet full of designer dresses and fund her exotic vacations. And most importantly, he used your life savings to aggressively pay off massive crippling gambling debts at high-stakes underground casinos. For exactly 3 seconds, the ballroom remained frozen in a state of absolute suspended disbelief. The elite guests stared at the $12 bank balance projected on the wall, their minds struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal. Then the polite society gala completely and utterly detonated. The shock morphed instantly into visceral explosive rage. The polished veneer of the elite country club crowd vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by the primal panic of people who had just realized their life savings had been stolen right in front of their faces. "Give me my money." Harrison Caldwell roared, his face turning an angry mottled purple as the veins bulged in his neck. He shoved past a row of delicate gold chairs, pointing a shaking, furious finger directly at Donovan. "You stole $2 million from my family, you absolute parasite." The crowd surged forward like a breaking dam. Wealthy investors, distinguished doctors, and high-powered lawyers began screaming, their voices layering over one another in a chaotic, deafening symphony of fury. Several guests turned their wrath immediately on my parents. They swarmed Thomas and Cynthia, backing them aggressively against the buffet tables, knocking over silver trays of expensive appetizers. "You vouched for him." A prominent socialite screamed directly into my mother's terrified face. "You stood at the country club and told us this was a guaranteed return. You set us up to be robbed by your own son-in-law." Cynthia cowered in fear, raising her hands in a desperate, pathetic attempt to shield herself from the barrage of furious accusations. Thomas was frantically stammering, waving his arms and trying to deny his involvement, but his voice was completely drowned out by the mob of angry friends he had personally recruited for the slaughter. They were demanding their money, threatening immediate lawsuits, and calling him a criminal accomplice. Down on the main floor, the situation turned violently physical. Preston Montgomery, a retired surgeon who had invested his entire pension into the fake fund, lunged directly at the center of the room. He grabbed Donovan by the lapels of his custom-tailored suit, violently jerking him upward with surprising strength. The luxurious motorized wheelchair tipped backward, sending Donovan crashing onto the polished marble floor. He scrambled desperately, trying to crawl away from the angry mob, abandoning his fake injuries entirely. His pristine white cast dragged uselessly behind him as he frantically tried to find an exit. Several other furious investors closed in around him, shouting threats and demanding their money, blocking his every move. Morgan was shrieking hysterically from the sidelines, completely ignored by the crowd that used to fawn over her every word. She tried to grab Preston to pull him off her husband, but another angry investor shoved her roughly aside. Her stolen crimson dress tore loudly at the seam, and she fell hard against the base of the stage, sobbing in pure, unadulterated panic as she watched her perfect life disintegrate. I stood completely still at the podium, looking down at the absolute destruction of my toxic family. They had built their entire identities on status, wealth, and fake prestige. Now they were being torn apart by the very people they had tried so hard to impress. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I watched the chaos unfold with the cold, calculating satisfaction of a woman who had meticulously engineered her own justice. David stepped up beside me on the stage, wrapping a solid, protective arm around my waist, as the crowd below us descended into a complete, uncontrollable riot. He looked down at my parents and my sister with nothing but cold disdain. Suddenly, a new terrifying sound sliced through the shouting, the crying, and the relentless sound of shattering glass. It was a loud, piercing wail, echoing rapidly up the long, manicured driveway of the estate. The deafening shriek of heavy sirens filled the night air, growing louder and more intense by the second. Violent strobe-like flashes of brilliant red and blue lights swept aggressively across the grand ballroom's massive floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the chaotic scene inside with the harsh, undeniable colors of federal law enforcement. The heavy double doors of the grand ballroom did not just open, they were violently breached. A deafening crash echoed over the screaming crowd as the massive oak doors were shoved wide open, hitting the interior walls with a force that shook the crystal chandeliers. The chaotic riot of angry investors instantly froze. The shouting died in their throats as a flood of armed federal agents poured into the extravagant space. Men and women wearing dark tactical vests with the letters FBI emblazoned in bold yellow across their chests swiftly formed a perimeter. Right behind them marched the formidable investigators of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. They moved with absolute terrifying precision. There was no hesitation. This was a highly coordinated multi-agency federal raid, and they had come to dismantle my family's fake empire. Special Agent Mitchell strode confidently to the center of the room. He bypassed the terrified country club elites, his eyes locked dead onto the pathetic figure scrambling on the marble floor. Donovan was still desperately trying to drag himself away from the furious mob of investors he had scammed. His pristine white cast scraped uselessly against the polished stone. He looked up at the federal agents, his eyes wide with wild, unadulterated panic. Donovan Mitchell's voice boomed across the silent ballroom, echoing with undeniable authority. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, and operating a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Donovan tried to play his final desperate card. He raised his hands in mock surrender, his voice shaking as he pointed to his bandaged head and his leg. "Please, you do not understand," he stammered, sweating profusely under the harsh lights. "I am a victim here. I was in a horrific car accident. I am severely injured. You cannot do this to a disabled man. I need my wheelchair." Mitchell did not even blink. He gave a sharp nod to two heavily built FBI agents standing nearby. The agents stepped forward, grabbed Donovan by his custom-tailored lapels, and hauled him roughly to his feet. The sudden, forceful movement caused Donovan's supposedly shattered leg to slam against the marble floor. The fake plaster cast cracked loudly down the middle, crumbling away to reveal a perfectly healthy, uninjured limb underneath. A collective gasp of absolute disgust rippled through the watching crowd. The billionaire visionary was nothing but a cheap, cowardly con artist. The agent spun Donovan around, yanking his arms aggressively behind his back. The sharp metallic click of cold steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the ballroom. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Donovan sagged against the agents, all the arrogant, boastful energy completely drained from his body, as the reality of a 15-year federal prison sentence crashed down upon him. Watching her husband being hauled away like a common criminal, Morgan completely lost her mind. The illusion of her flawless high society life was disintegrating right in front of her eyes. She scrambled up from the floor where she had fallen earlier, her stolen crimson designer dress torn and ruined. Her perfectly styled hair was a chaotic mess. She looked around the room, her chest heaving, until her wild, furious eyes locked directly onto me, standing tall and untouched on the mahogany stage. "You did this!" Morgan shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams, sounding entirely unhinged. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her face contorted into a mask of pure venomous hatred. "You ruined everything, you jealous, spiteful bitch. You destroyed this family because you could not stand to see me succeed. You set us up." She lunged forward, intending to charge the stage and attack me, but she did not even make it 2 steps. A female FBI agent expertly intercepted her, grabbing Morgan's arm and twisting it sharply behind her back with practiced efficiency. Morgan let out a shocked yelp, struggling violently against the agent's iron grip, thrashing her body from side to side in a desperate, pathetic tantrum. "Let go of me!" Morgan screamed, kicking her expensive heels against the agent's shins. "Do you know who I am? I am a victim. She is the one you should be arresting. She is a liar. Morgan, you are under arrest." The female agent stated coldly, effortlessly, pinning Morgan's other arm and snapping a second pair of handcuffs securely onto her wrists. "You are being charged with conspiracy to commit federal fraud, medical identity theft, and grand insurance fraud. You have the right to an attorney." Morgan stopped thrashing. The words, medical identity theft, hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. She looked up at me, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks. The arrogant golden child who had spent her entire life stealing what belonged to me was finally realizing that there was no mother or father who could save her from federal prosecution. She sobbed hysterically as the agents dragged her forcefully out of the ballroom, her cries echoing down the long, luxurious hallway until she was shoved into the back of a waiting squad car. From my vantage point on the stage, I shifted my gaze to my parents. Thomas and Cynthia were standing near the grand buffet tables, completely paralyzed by a profound, agonizing terror. The wealthy friends they had spent decades trying to impress had entirely abandoned them, backing away as if my parents were carrying a highly contagious disease. No one wanted to be associated with the masterminds of a federal Ponzi scheme, but the nightmare for Thomas and Cynthia was just beginning. The Internal Revenue Service does not just arrest criminals, they dismantle empires. Scores of federal inspectors began fanning out across the sprawling mansion. They carried thick stacks of barcode stickers and heavy cardboard boxes. I watched as an IRS agent walked right past my trembling mother and slapped a bright red seizure notice directly onto a priceless antique vase sitting on an entryway pedestal. Other agents were already moving into the private home offices, confiscating hard drives, sealing financial filing cabinets, and cataloging the expensive artwork hanging on the walls. Special Agent Mitchell walked over to where my father was standing. Thomas was physically shaking, his face pale and glistening with cold sweat. Mitchell pulled a thick, heavily stamped legal document from his tactical vest and shoved it directly against my father's chest. Thomas Mitchell said, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy, "You are being served with a federal asset forfeiture order. We have probable cause to believe that this estate, the vehicles in your driveway, and the luxury assets within these walls were either funded by illicit money or used to facilitate federal wire fraud. Everything here is now the property of the United States government. You and your wife have exactly 1 hour to pack a single bag of basic necessities and vacate the premises immediately." Cynthia let out a broken, agonizing wail. She collapsed onto her knees right there on the polished marble floor, burying her face in her hands. The massive, beautiful mansion she had used to belittle me, the wealth she had weaponized to make me feel small, was being ripped away from her in a matter of seconds. Thomas stood dead still, staring blankly at the federal seizure order in his trembling hands, watching the flashing red and blue lights paint his ruined kingdom. The wheels of federal justice turn slowly, but they grind with absolute merciless precision. Over the next 3 months, the glamorous, chaotic spectacle of the charity gala faded into the cold, sterile reality of federal courtrooms and grand jury indictments. The multi-million-dollar facade my family had spent years meticulously building was systematically dismantled under the blinding fluorescent lights of the justice system. Donovan hired a slick, aggressive defense attorney using a small fraction of funds he had managed to hide domestically, attempting to spin a narrative of unfortunate business miscalculations. He sat at the defense table in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, looking entirely stripped of the arrogant charisma that used to fill a room. He was no longer a billionaire visionary. He was just another desperate con artist trying to charm his way out of a cage. His lawyer argued that the real estate market had simply taken an unexpected downturn, that the funds were temporarily reallocated to manage liquidity, and that Donovan always intended to pay his investors back. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to rebrand a massive Ponzi scheme as a simple breach of fiduciary duty. But they severely underestimated the opponent sitting on the other side of the courtroom. I did not just hand the federal prosecutors a basic spreadsheet. I handed them a masterpiece of forensic accounting. I took the witness stand and systematically destroyed every single lie Donovan and his defense team tried to construct. I walked the judge and the jury through the exact, undeniable digital footprint of his offshore wire transfers. I projected the transaction maps showing how investor capital from my parents' country club friends bypassed commercial development accounts entirely and went straight into paying off high stakes gambling debts and luxury sports car leases. I provided the undeniable proof of the forged signatures, the fake corporate tax returns, and the dummy shell companies. The financial dossier I built was absolutely bulletproof. By the time I stepped down from the witness stand, Donovan's defense attorney was completely silent, staring down at his legal pad, knowing his client was entirely indefensible. Morgan did not fare any better. She attempted a wildly different defense strategy. She tried to play the innocent, manipulated wife. She sat in the courtroom crying genuine tears this time, claiming Donovan was an abusive, controlling husband who forced her to participate in the medical identity theft and the insurance fraud. She told the judge she had no idea the money was stolen and that she was merely following orders to protect her family. Her performance might have worked on a sympathetic jury if it were not for the audio recording. The federal prosecutor stood up and played the digital audio file I had captured at the hospital and broadcast it at the gala. Morgan's own vicious, arrogant voice echoed through the solemn courtroom, bragging about stealing my husband's social security number, admitting to forging my electronic signature, and gleefully threatening to send me to federal prison if I dared to report her. The entire courtroom listened as she proudly claimed ownership of the massive orchestrated fraud. The tears instantly dried on her face. Her defense attorney rubbed his temples in sheer defeat. You cannot play the helpless victim when the jury can hear you actively directing the blackmail operation. The sentencing was swift, definitive, and profoundly satisfying. The federal judge, a no-nonsense woman who clearly despised white-collar predators, looked down at Donovan from her elevated bench. She did not mince words. She called his actions a predatory, calculated assault on the financial security of trusting citizens. Donovan was sentenced to a mandatory minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Because the convictions included severe federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft, there would be absolutely no possibility of early parole. He was also ordered to pay massive lifelong restitution to the victims he had defrauded. Morgan stood before the judge, next trembling violently as the reality of her actions finally caught up with her. The judge reprimanded her for her breathtaking entitlement and her willingness to destroy her own sister's life to maintain a facade of wealth. Morgan was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, medical identity theft, and insurance fraud. She sobbed hysterically as the bailiffs placed her in handcuffs and led her out of the courtroom, completely stripped of her designer clothes, her stolen wealth, and her arrogant pride. While they were being processed into the federal prison system, the government agencies moved rapidly to clean up the wreckage they left behind. The Internal Revenue Service and the credit bureaus worked directly with my investigative team to completely restore David's identity. Every single fraudulent credit card, every defaulted commercial loan, and the massive $350,000 hospital bill were entirely wiped from his record. We received the final clearance letter in the mail, and I watched the physical weight of the anxiety completely lift off my husband's shoulders. His pristine credit score was reinstated. His landscape architecture business flourished, completely untainted by the chaos my family had tried to drag him into. We were entirely free from their toxic grip, our financial future safe and secure. As for my parents, Thomas and Cynthia, the federal prosecutors, ultimately decided not to pursue direct criminal charges against them. The investigation proved they were legally classified as unwitting accomplices, essentially useful idiots who were too blinded by greed and status to realize they were actively recruiting victims for a Ponzi scheme. They did not forge the documents or initiate the offshore wire transfers. They walked out of the federal courthouse as free citizens avoiding prison time by a very narrow margin. But as I watched them walk down the concrete steps of the judicial building, their shoulders slumped and their faces etched with profound despair, I knew their freedom was a hollow victory. They were about to face a reality that for two people pathologically obsessed with high society prestige and material wealth was going to be significantly worse than any prison sentence. The federal prosecutors might have let Thomas and Cynthia walk out of the courthouse without criminal convictions, but the domestic financial system operates with a completely different kind of ruthlessness. Exactly 1 week after Donovan and Morgan were locked inside their federal prison cells, a fleet of aggressive bank representatives and armed local sheriffs arrived at my parents' sprawling suburban estate. Thomas opened his heavy custom-carved oak door, expecting to bark orders and bully his way out of whatever minor inconvenience was standing on his front porch. Instead, a solemn deputy handed him a thick, densely packed stack of immediate foreclosure documents. It turned out Donovan had not just been stealing cash from the elite country club members. In his desperate, chaotic final months, trying to keep the massive Ponzi scheme afloat, my brother-in-law had quietly and fraudulently taken out a massive second mortgage on my parents' beloved mansion. He used forged power of attorney documents seamlessly supplied by Morgan to completely leverage the entire property. Because the commercial loan was deeply tied to the fraudulent enterprise and had been entirely defaulted on the bank, took swift, absolute action. The estate my mother had proudly weaponized for decades to prove her superiority over everyone else was seized immediately. They were given exactly 48 hours to pack whatever personal belongings the federal agents had not already confiscated during the initial raid. I took a detour past their neighborhood a few days later and watched from a safe distance as Thomas and Cynthia carried cheap, flimsy cardboard boxes out to a rented moving van. The perfectly manicured front lawn that David used to be relentlessly mocked for maintaining was now littered with neon green eviction notices. The physical fortress of their arrogance was entirely gone. But the social destruction they were about to face was going to be significantly more agonizing. My parents had spent 30 grueling years meticulously cultivating their elite status. They worshipped their social standing, their golf handicaps, and their designer wardrobes far more than they ever loved their own flesh and blood. Now that same high society completely turned on them with absolute vicious fury. The wealthy friends Thomas and Cynthia had eagerly and proudly recruited for Donovan's fake real estate fund did not care that my parents were technically classified as unwitting accomplices by the federal government. They only cared that their retirement millions were gone. Civil lawsuits began raining down on Thomas and Cynthia like a relentless, suffocating monsoon. Harrison Caldwell, the man my father played golf with every single Sunday morning, led the aggressive legal charge. He filed a massive civil liability suit against my parents claiming gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and active facilitation of fraud. Dozens of other elite investors quickly followed suit, piling on astronomical legal claims. Within a month, every single remaining bank account my parents had access to was completely frozen by a civil court order. The prestigious, incredibly exclusive country club they treated as their true sanctuary held an emergency board meeting. They permanently revoked my parents' membership with a unanimous vote. Security guards were explicitly instructed to physically escort Thomas off the premises if he ever dared to show his face near the clubhouse ever again. The very women my mother used to host lavish catered brunch parties for now actively crossed the street to avoid walking on the same sidewalk as her. My parents were absolute pariahs, completely and utterly exiled from the only world that held any meaning to them. Stripped of their luxurious home, their stolen wealth, and their protective social armor, Thomas and Cynthia were violently shoved into a harsh reality they had spent their entire lives openly mocking. With their accounts frozen and legal fees piling up from the endless civil lawsuits, they had absolutely no financial safety net left. They were forcefully evicted from their temporary rental and had to move into a cramped, dilapidated one-bedroom apartment in a run-down, crime-ridden suburb far outside the city limits. The walls of their new home were paper-thin, the heating unit barely worked, and the shared parking lot was constantly littered with broken glass and garbage. For two people whose entire identities revolved around luxury, superiority, and prestige, the psychological destruction was absolute and unyielding. My mother, a woman who used to throw away expensive designer dresses after wearing them, just one time now, had to stand in the harsh fluorescent-lit aisles of a discount grocery store, carefully counting her crumpled dollar bills just to buy basic canned goods. The ultimate humiliation came a few weeks later. I heard through the grapevine of a mutual acquaintance that Cynthia was spotted standing in a long, winding line at a local community food pantry. She was wearing an old faded coat, trying desperately to hide her face behind a pair of scratched sunglasses, praying nobody would recognize her. But someone did. A former society friend drove past the food pantry in a shiny luxury SUV. The woman actively rolled down her tinted window just to stare at my mother with undisguised raw contempt. The utter humiliation of being looked down upon by the exact people she used to desperately try to impress broke Cynthia completely. She collapsed right there on the dirty sidewalk, sobbing into her hands while strangers walked past her. Thomas tried desperately to find employment to pay the mounting legal bills and keep the lights on in their terrible apartment. But no respectable firm, no corporate office, and no small business would ever hire a 62-year-old man heavily associated with a national multi-million-dollar federal fraud case. He was entirely unemployable. They were completely trapped in a dark nightmare of their own making, suffocating daily under the crushing weight of their own vanity, greed, and toxic arrogance. They had hit absolute rock bottom. Every single bridge they had ever built was burned to ashes. Every friend they had ever made had turned into a vicious enemy holding a lawsuit. They were out of money, out of options, and completely out of hope. The arrogant pride that had defined their entire existence was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, gnawing hunger for basic survival. Driven by sheer, unadulterated desperation, they decided to play their very last pathetic card. They managed to track down the forwarding address of my brand new residence. And late one freezing evening, Cynthia and Thomas dragged themselves to the front entrance of my new home, preparing to beg the exact daughter they had spent 33 years calling a complete failure. The private elevator chimed softly as it reached the top floor of the most exclusive high-rise building in the downtown financial district. The polished steel doors slid open, revealing the private secured foyer of my penthouse suite. For years, I had deliberately let my parents believe David and I lived a painfully modest life. I let them mock our suburban starter home and my supposed data entry salary. I never bothered to correct them or flaunt the massive corporate bonuses, the lucrative consulting contracts, or the high six-figure salary I commanded as a top-tier federal forensic auditor. I invested my money quietly securing this multi-million-dollar penthouse under a private trust. Now Thomas and Cynthia were standing in the gleaming marble hallway of my actual reality, looking completely shattered. They wore cheap, mismatched layers to fight off the freezing winter wind, their faces hollowed out by stress and impending poverty. They stared at the towering, custom-designed mahogany double doors, realizing in real time that the daughter they had spent 3 decades calling a complete failure was actually vastly more successful than their fake billionaire son-in-law had ever been. The heavy security bell echoed through the massive open-concept living room of the penthouse. I did not rush to the door. I walked over to the digital security monitor mounted on the wall and watched the high-definition feed. Cynthia was shivering, clutching the collar of her thin coat, looking up at the camera lens with wild, desperate eyes. Thomas stood behind her, his shoulders hunched, completely stripped of the towering arrogance that had defined his entire existence. I pressed the intercom button, my voice transmitting clearly through the secure outdoor speaker. "Yes," I asked, my tone as flat and unbothered as if I were speaking to a random door-to-door salesperson. Hearing my voice, Cynthia completely broke down. She threw herself against the heavy wooden doors, sobbing hysterically. Her knees buckled and she collapsed right there onto the polished marble floor of the foyer. "Lauren, please open the door," Cynthia wailed, her hands smacking flat against the thick wood. "You have to save us. We have absolutely nowhere else to go. The banks took everything. The lawyers took the rest. Please help us pay off these civil lawsuits. We are your family, Lauren. We are family." I did not unlock the deadbolt. I did not open the door even an inch. I simply stood on the other side of the reinforced security barrier, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, radiating an absolute impenetrable coldness. I listened to my mother sob on the floor, and I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no lingering sense of daughterly obligation. You threw $5,000 in cash on my coffee table and told me to buy a cheap dress to make your fake son-in-law look good, I said calmly, my voice slicing through the intercom speaker with lethal precision. You stood in the emergency room and demanded I commit a federal felony to protect a drunk driver who stole my husband's identity. You told me David's clean record did not matter because he just plants bushes for a living. You told me to shut my mouth and know my place. Thomas stepped closer to the camera, his face pale and twisted with misery. We were wrong, Lauren. He pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. We were so terribly wrong about Donovan and Morgan. We were blind, but we are begging you now. You clearly have the money. You live in a penthouse. You can afford to hire a legal team to get these investors off our backs. If you do not write a check to settle these debts, we are going to end up sleeping on the streets. I took a sip of the sparkling water I had brought with me to the monitor. I let them sit in the agonizing silence for a full minute, letting the absolute futility of their begging sink deep into their bones. They were not apologizing for decades of emotional abuse. They were not apologizing for constantly prioritizing Morgan. They were only apologizing because their golden ticket had turned out to be a counterfeit, and they desperately needed a new host to leech off of. I looked at the security feed, watching the two people who had spent my entire life trying to tear me down now groveling on their hands and knees outside my fortress. You spent your entire lives worshipping money and social status, I told them, my voice smooth and unforgiving. You happily fed your own friends to a financial predator just so you could brag at the country club. You chose your side. You chose your golden child. Now you get to live with the exact consequences of those choices. Cynthia began pounding her fists against the door again, leaving desperate smeared handprints on the polished wood. Lauren, you cannot do this to your own mother and father, she screamed, her voice hoarse and broken. It is selfish. It is unbelievably selfish to hoard all this wealth while your parents are starving and homeless. You have to sacrifice for us. The word selfish echoed in the grand quiet space of my penthouse. It was the exact same word they had weaponized against me my entire life. Every time I set a boundary, every time I refused to hand over my savings to fund Morgan's extravagant lifestyle, they called me selfish. They always demanded I sacrifice my own well-being to maintain their fragile, toxic illusion of a perfect family. I leaned directly into the intercom microphone, my expression hardening into absolute stone. You always told me not to be selfish, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper that commanded their total attention. You always told me I needed to know how to sacrifice myself for the sake of the family reputation. I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make their hearts pound with sudden, terrifying realization. I am doing exactly what you taught me. I am sacrificing the two of you to protect the perfectly clean, untouchable reputation of David and myself. I kept my finger firmly pressed against the intercom button, making sure the high-definition audio captured every single syllable of my final statement to the people who had brought me into this world, only to treat me like a disposable asset. Thomas had finally looked up at the camera. His eyes were completely hollowed out, entirely devoid of the arrogant country club pride that had defined his entire existence. He looked like a broken, pathetic old man who had bet his entire life on a losing hand. Cynthia was still weeping on the marble floor, her sobs echoing through the pristine hallway of my building. You spent the last 5 years telling everyone who would listen how incredibly proud you were of your billionaire son-in-law. I said, my voice echoing with absolute lethal finality through the speaker. You worshipped the ground he walked on. You happily offered up your own friends on a silver platter just to bask in his fake glory. You looked at my honest, hardworking husband and called him a glorified lawn boy. Well, your billionaire is currently sitting in a federal penitentiary wearing an orange jumpsuit. If you need money to pay off your massive civil lawsuits, I suggest you go visit him during visiting hours and ask him for a loan. Do not ever come to my home again. Do not ever call my phone again. Do not ever bother our lives again. Before Thomas could even open his mouth to utter another pathetic, desperate excuse, I pulled my finger away from the console. I pressed the bright red disconnect button. The audio feed cut off instantly with a sharp, definitive click. The agonizing sound of my mother's weeping and my father's desperate pleading vanished entirely, replaced by the profound, beautiful silence of my secure multi-million-dollar penthouse. I stood there for a moment, simply breathing in the quiet. I watched the video monitor for a few more seconds. Thomas slowly reached down and helped Cynthia to her feet. They looked at the heavy mahogany doors one last time before turning around and shuffling back toward the elevator, completely defeated. They were finally gone, banished back to the miserable, impoverished reality they had so meticulously engineered for themselves. I turned my back on the security screen and walked away from the foyer. My footsteps echoed softly against the imported hardwood floors as I made my way back into the sprawling, open-concept living room. The ambient lighting was dim and warm, a stark contrast to the cold, harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway where this entire nightmare had begun. David was standing by the massive kitchen island. He had taken off his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, looking completely relaxed and entirely at peace. He was smiling warmly as he carefully poured a vintage red wine into 2 large crystal glasses. It was a quiet, intimate moment of celebration between a husband and wife who had weathered a massive storm and emerged entirely unscathed. I walked over to him and he handed me a glass. He did not ask what they said. He did not ask if I felt guilty. He already knew the answers. He wrapped his strong, comforting arm around my shoulders, and together we walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that stretched across the entire length of the penthouse. We stood shoulder to shoulder, sipping our wine and looking out over the breathtaking panoramic view of the city skyline. The towering skyscrapers glittered like diamonds against the pitch-black night sky. Millions of lights stretched out for miles, representing millions of lives, millions of stories, and millions of choices. Down there, somewhere in the dark, my parents were driving back to a freezing, dilapidated apartment with absolutely no future and no hope. Up here in the warm, secure fortress we had built with our own honest labor, we had everything we could ever possibly need. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute weight of the past 33 years completely lift off my chest. I had spent my entire childhood desperately trying to earn the love and approval of people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. I had let them gaslight me, belittle me, and treat me like a second-class citizen in my own family. But the moment they tried to drag my husband into their fraudulent criminal schemes, they crossed a line that I was perfectly equipped to defend. Society constantly tells us that family is everything. We are conditioned to believe that blood obligations demand infinite forgiveness, infinite patience, and infinite sacrifice. We are told to turn a blind eye to toxic behavior simply because the people hurting us happen to share our genetic code. But the truth is entirely different. Justice does not naturally come to those who suffer silently under the crushing weight of family abuse. The universe does not simply hand out karma to toxic parents or manipulative siblings just because they vaguely deserve it. Sometimes you have to take absolute control of the narrative. You have to stand up, stop crying, and design your own justice. You have to face the people who abused you with an incredibly cold head, unwavering patience, and a relentless determination to protect your own peace. And sometimes you just need to unleash a stack of undeniable bulletproof financial records to let the federal government do the heavy lifting for you. My name is Lauren, and I did not just survive my toxic family, I completely dismantled them. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever had to cut ties with abusive relatives or protect yourself from the people who were supposed to love you, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of ultimate survival and sweet absolute justice. Remember, you do not owe your peace to anyone who thrives on your destruction. The most profound lesson I took away from this entire ordeal is that shared DNA does not give anyone a free pass to destroy your peace. Society constantly conditions us to believe that we must endlessly forgive our toxic relatives. We are told to keep the peace, to swallow our pain, and to protect the family name at all costs. But tolerating abuse is never an act of love. It is a profound betrayal of your own self-worth. My parents and my sister genuinely believed their bloodline entitled them to my husband's identity, our financial ruin, and my unquestioning loyalty. They were dead wrong. They called me selfish for refusing to drown with them. But I learned the hard way that walking away from a burning building is not selfish. It is basic survival. True family is built on mutual respect, unwavering support, and honest love. If the people who are supposed to protect you become the very predators you need protection from, you have every absolute right to lock your door and never look back. Justice rarely falls from the sky. You cannot simply wait for karma to magically balance the scales when you are dealing with manipulative people. Sometimes you have to engineer your own justice. You have to keep a perfectly cold head, gather your undeniable evidence, set absolutely unbreakable boundaries, and let the harsh truth do the heavy lifting for you. You owe absolutely nothing to people who treat your existence as a disposable asset to be exploited for their own selfish gain. Protect your peace fiercely and never apologize for it. If you are currently dealing with toxic family members who drain your energy and disrespect your boundaries, I want you to know that walking away is a powerful choice. Share your own experiences with setting family boundaries in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more empowering stories of survival and sweet justice.